KOST, stereo at 103.5 in Los Angeles.
The following program is presented in the public interest. This is Confrontation, an examination of significant events and issues of our day. Here now is your host on Confrontation, Ben Thumb.
Thank you. On behalf of my co-host, Dick Trubo, welcome to Confrontation. President Richard Nixon has referred to tonight's guest as today's version of Will Rogers. Others have referred to him as America's conscience, and still others have referred to him in terms that we can't repeat over the air. I refer to him as Mort Sahl, and those of you out there who have been with us from the beginning here on Confrontation may recall that our very first guest was Morton Sahl. And Mort, at that time, we asked you to assess the performance of Richard Nixon after 9 months in office. And part of your answer alluded to the fact that Nixon had more people against him after 9 months than LBJ had against him in 5 years. Now it's 9 months later. How do you feel Richard Nixon is doing? Any better?
Well, an ordinary woman could produce 2 children in 18 months. I don't mean to compare the president in that sense of productivity, but I think President Nixon is America's Will Rogers. We might as well be even. No, I don't. I was listening to a radio station. May I mention another station?
Sure.
I know I can, but I mean, the guys always say that on television. They always say that like that's very daring. It always turn to Merv Griffin. They say, listen, I'm going to appear at the White House Tuesday to entertain the president. Is it all right if I mention another country or something like that? But anyway, I was listening to KABC, and a guy said, I'm out of work. I was in the space industry, and I'm out of work. I don't know what to do. And Marv Gray, who he claims is a former CIA agent, which is about as accurate as saying I'm a former member of the mafia, he said, I don't ever feel you really graduate. He said, Marv Gray said to him, that's the trouble. He said, all these doves are asking for peace in the Senate, and as a result is all these people out of work, which equates America to being a murder machine. The president said he had a plan to end the war, and it's one thing about him. He's terrific at security. He hasn't told us the plan yet. I like the way he can keep a secret. And he also said that, I don't know, I read a description the other day, somebody said, to watch the pomaded Vice President Agnew stand there, if you didn't know, you'd think that he's the president, and he's being deferential to this guy who may succeed him someday. So I don't know. The president himself said that he might be a one-term president.
Well, Mort, honestly, though.
Yes, as opposed to...
How do you feel President Nixon is handling the Vietnam War? Seriously.
He's handling the war according to the scenario, and the scenario is that the war will go on regardless of who is president. You recall when I did the program before, I said that the people who really rule this country, and that is the coalition of the warfare state, would continue. In other words, the people who have continuity in office, who would be the people of the Central Intelligence Agency, the
J. Edgar Hoover,
the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Hoover, if he's still in office, I haven't checked. Try to check every morning. And but I mean, the people who run this country, so in other words, it will go on. Not that J. Edgar Hoover is running the Vietnamese War. I don't mean to say that by any means. But the fact is that it will go on. And when I hear people allude to the fact that Nixon is making the same mistakes that Johnson made, even though they are of different personality orders, I'm led to believe that the presidency is almost extraneous. Because I cannot believe that Johnson wasn't savvy enough to end that war and keep his political career going, or that Richard Nixon doesn't know that the American people do not want that war. That war is not supposed to end, I gather. In other words, President Nixon has expanded the war. And the only thing that he has successfully closed has been many universities. Well, he's done a great job of that.
But do you feel that he's possibly taking orders from the military rather than making his own decisions about the war?
I believe that a coalition of the warfare state includes the military and industrial power in this country and the Central Intelligence Agency, and I believe that they are more deeply embedded than the President of the United States is. I believe that that is a... I don't believe that there's been a president who challenged the military, with the exception of President Kennedy or President Roosevelt, I haven't seen any.
Senator Hatfield said not too many days ago that if the Vietnam War isn't ended by 72, that Ronald Reagan may be the Republican nominee. That's kind of a mind blower.
Only in the sense that it'd be very little that could blow the minds of Americans nowadays. Only in the sense that if the old refuse to listen, and the young yell any louder, there will be a confrontation, and this will either be a socialistic country or it will be a military aristocracy, and in either event, it won't be much fun, but that's what's going to happen. There's going to be a revolution in this country if something doesn't happen soon. And because people have been taught that they should expect everything, consumer goods, and if they can't get it, they'll take it. And make no mistake about it, that does not mean Negroes taking television sets out of the white front store and bringing them back for service every 3 months. That means everybody who wants everything. That means all those guys with the flags on their helmets. It means everybody. There'll be a revolution. And last night I went to see a movie called 2 Mules for Sister Sarah. Excellent, by the way. And I recommend it to everybody. And in this picture, you'll see the American Westerner, the resourceful American. And as a friend of mine said, they must be spinning in their graves now to see what their sons turned out to be.
Mort, you said at one time that you thought the economy must be subsidized by war. Now, even if we get out of Vietnam, do you still feel that way?
Yeah, America's the colonized country, not Vietnam. Doesn't matter whether it's Santo Domingo. If we get out of Vietnam, Vietnam doesn't mean anything. First of all, he went into Cambodia, the president. Then he got out of Cambodia after a month. So everybody said, yeah, it's terrific. He took his foot off my Adam's apple. Now it doesn't hurt when he twists my arm so much. That's, he kept his word. Oh, that's terrific. But they'll always manage to go somewhere. There'll always be a crisis. And it's good for the economy. I don't mind crisis. I hope I don't sound to listeners like I'm objecting. I don't mind, I don't resent my country being driven mad with paranoia or anything like that, or all the young men being taken away. Because after all, if we presuppose that people hate to see their kids taken into the service, we presuppose that all people love their children. And of course, that doesn't hold up. We know that from Sigmund Freud.
Do you know how you sound to some of our listeners? The first time you were on our program, we got a lot of mail from people who said, gee, I really enjoyed Mort Sahl, but what did he say? In other words, a lot of people listen to you, but at the end, I don't think they can really understand what you're saying. You seem to be talking over the heads of a lot of people.
Who, me? No, I represent the ordinary man. I'm very much concerned with him.
I don't think you're
But it's hard to get through those hard hats, though,
The hard hats who were in New York. Now, I've been a member of organized labor, and I belong to 9 unions. I belong to the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, in case you'd like me to spin a record tonight. And I want to tell you, all they're interested in is the next wage raise and dropping a box off the forklift so they can take samples home. The ones who marched in New York were infiltrated by the Central Intelligence Agency, and the right is just as desensitized to penetration as the left is. And later on tonight, I don't think this is the proper time yet, from a standpoint of production values, I'd like to talk about the Central Intelligence Agency and what advances it has made since we last met.
Do you think that patriotism is an obsolete word? Does it mean anything to you?
Does patriotism mean anything to me?
I mean, I imagine, do you have an American flag on your car windshield?
Well, there are many ways of manifesting patriotism. I tried to get one, but they were out. See, there were a lot of patriots. It seems to me that patriotism in this country is, I believe that, I think we're lucky that the Russians and the Chinese have shown such forbearance and have not gone to war with us, because I'm not sure that this country could win a war now with the kind of patriots we have. And I believe that all those fellas with the flags on their cars would not be fighting the Chinese, but would be down at the Mayfair market hoarding dog food, which is a fitting diet for that group.
Mort, you said at one time that John F. Kennedy was the most noble figure to come up against the establishment in recent times.
Yeah.
And that we saw what happened to him. Those were your words. Establishment-wise, you were referring to, and here we go back again to the continuity, to J. Edgar Hoover and his 46 years in office, Richard Helms as head of the CIA, and General Earl Wheeler as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You said these men were the continuity, and the popular elected officials, like the president, were the transients.
Mm-hmm.
Now, were you also linking these men, this continuity, were you linking them somehow with the assassination of President Kennedy?
Well, you mean by that remark?
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, I never make any subtle remarks about the assassination of President Kennedy. Since I was in the investigation of the assassination, the only legally authorized investigation of the president's death in this country, since I was honored to be a part of that, and since I know who killed the president, and although I've been a voice in the wilderness in that, it doesn't matter, because I think within 3 to 5 years the entire country will know, and that'll be a time for rationalization, by the way.
Could you tell us now?
Could I tell you who killed the president now? Yeah, the president was assassinated by the Central Intelligence Agency, and there are grave implications of the role of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in his death.
Well, if the American public doesn't know that yet, how are they going to know it in 3 to 5 years? Are the Joint Chiefs and the CIA going to let the American public know it?
The Joint Chiefs and the CIA will be irrelevant then, because this country was structured by Thomas Jefferson, and there is no way that you can keep that material back.
It may have been structured by Thomas Jefferson, but it's not being controlled by him now.
Well, I wouldn't discard that remark quite that readily. It's more controlled by Thomas Jefferson from the grave than it is by those men. In other words, fascism is very transient. See, the most successful fascist of all time wasn't even an American. I know that's hard for you to accept in the light of current values, but it was Adolf Hitler, who had about 13 years, and then that was the end. It doesn't work. However, you know, I wish what we're doing here is what always happens on television. People ask me provocative questions. We talk in headlines. We talk like slogans or bumper stickers, and I'm not allowed to qualify anything. If we're really going to talk about that, I think that, you know, President Kennedy deserves more than that, and I think it very important that every American know that the entire story of how the anti-war John F. Kennedy was annihilated by the Central Intelligence Agency will be told and documented in a book by the District Attorney of New Orleans, which will be published very quickly. That's one of the ways the people will know.
All right. Now last time that you were with us, Mort, you allowed us to how you were working with Jim Garrison and how very significant that was to you. Now, Jim Garrison has been pretty quiet lately, and we wondered if he hasn't just decided to quietly give up his investigation. I assume not, to hear you talk.
Garrison has been to court with Clay Shaw in the last 2 weeks, and he's going to be tried for perjury within 4 weeks. The second thing is Bill Gurvich has been tried for theft of public records and bribery. His trial is scheduled. Tom Bethel, the former archivist for Garrison, is charged with theft of public records, and his trial is within 3 weeks. Now, perjury means that Garrison has 26 witnesses who saw Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald. Remember, everybody? The man who killed the president you loved so much, with Clay Shaw. Now, those are all facts of life, and that's all going on in New Orleans now. Now, if no one chooses to report that here, if I were you, I would be alarmed. So, to return to the point, the last time I was here, I went into great detail about this trial, including the testimony of the pathologist, Colonel Pierre Fink of the Army Medical Corps, forensic pathologist, who signed an autopsy he did not perform on President Kennedy. I also told you, if you recall, that a Major General arrived from the Joint Chiefs of Staff as their emissary, stood at President Kennedy's head, and said, "I'm running this show," and directed the pathologist not to examine the president. Your president was killed, and nobody knows how many times he was wounded, and they were directed by an emissary of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, direct testimony in the New Orleans courtroom, not to do anything about it. But we did all this, and I'm curious as to why you're asking me to repeat this.
Basically, Mort, because back then you were saying some things about what was going to happen eventually with the trial in New Orleans. And now, in the summer of 1970, almost 7 years after John Kennedy's death, we still don't know anything about it. Now, you just told me that a couple of weeks ago, Garrison went to court with Clay Shaw.
Yeah.
I didn't know about that, and I didn't see anything come over the wire on that. Now, you told me last time that the wire services are controlled by the CIA. Did the CIA have anything to do with repressing that news? Or was
The
it...
day that Garrison was in court with Clay Shaw, and Shaw tried to quash the case, and the judge ruled that he could be innocent of conspiracy and nonetheless guilty of perjury when saying he was not acquainted with Lee Harvey Oswald, and that there would be a trial for perjury, the Los Angeles Times carried on the front page that the case was dead. And I accuse you of quoting the Los Angeles Times. That's a derivative opinion. You said the case was dead because you read that the case was dead.
No, Mort, I didn't say the case was dead. I asked you if it's dead. I don't know whether it's dead or not. You know more about that than I do. Now, you said the president had no autopsy, right?
Yeah, I told you that the last time we were here.
You said that Dr. Pierre Fink
All right, then
was
I'll
the
qualify
assistant pathologist
Mhm.
on the president's autopsy, and that based on his testimony, the president had no autopsy. You also said that there are still bullets unaccounted for in the president's body. That's all you said.
I'm glad, that you're also riled up about it. It's good. After 7 years, I would think so. Why didn't he have an autopsy? Can we document that? The Colonel Humes, you recall, Commander Humes, who was to do the autopsy, who was in charge of the autopsy, testified to the Warren Commission that he burned his notes. So nobody saw the autopsy. The second thing is that a major general who was an emissary of the Joint Chiefs of Staff stood at the head of the president and told Colonel Fink and Commander Humes not to track the bullets at the entrance wounds in the president's neck, and not to section his head. They saw no photos of the wounds, and they did not section the president's head. They have no idea of the track of any of the bullets or how many times the president was wounded. They signed the autopsy in November of 1963, and they saw the first photos of the president's body 3 years later. The president has not had an autopsy.
Okay, Mort, we'll leave it at that. Changing the subject here so cleverly, what are your thoughts on Ted Kennedy's political stock now that the Chappaquiddick verdict is in? Do you think he might run for president?
No, I don't think he'll run for president because I think he wants to save his life.
Do you see any bright political hope on the horizon to oppose Richard Nixon?
No, it's interesting, isn't it? It's quite a coincidence that the Democratic Party have a president who is not popular at all, and that there isn't anybody to oppose him. And the only viable peace candidate, oddly enough, was found in sordid circumstances with a young lady, and thereby is disqualified. The only man who would marshal all the peace forces in this country, oddly enough, is disqualified. I think he was gone for 9 hours. That's just about what chloral hydrate will do.
Is it possible for any viable peace candidate to come to the front and survive, if what you're saying is true?
Yes, if he took certain precautions.
Like what? You mean security precautions?
Yes, he should have a bodyguard.
Well, Robert Kennedy had a bodyguard.
Well, I'm sorry at such a young and tender age that you're so cynical about all that, but I believe that if a man is a president, he's a peace president in this country, that he should have 1,000-man bodyguard. I'm talking about a palace guard. I'm not talking about Rayford Johnson and Roosevelt Greer by any means. Robert Kennedy's death was predicted by the district attorney in New Orleans. In fact, Robert Kennedy's office was in touch with the district attorney's office in New Orleans. We told him if he won in California that he'd be killed. And I'm sorry we were right. I'm sorry for all of us.
Do you feel that Sirhan killed him?
It certainly looks that way. However,
I thought you once said he was manipulated by someone.
That doesn't mean he didn't kill him. It means that the art of assassination has grown in this country, and there were so many slip-ups in the killing of President Kennedy, and so much reflection on high authority in this country, and such a crisis of confidence in the government since, as a result, that assassins are now programmed on a need-to-know basis. They don't need to be included on the grand plan. They don't need to be anymore.
If he was manipulated, who do you think did the manipulating?
The Central Intelligence Agency.
The same people who control the wire services. You mentioned that once, and I wonder if you'd elaborate.
Yeah, I'm just wondering why we're repeating it again, because we did it on the first tape.
Right, you said the Central Intelligence Agency controls the wire services.
I told you the Central Intelligence Agency passes around a few $100s a week extra to stringers in wire service offices in major cities across the country to pull stories off the wire that they do not feel are in the national interest. And that's at the discretion of the fellow that they bribe. And there are Americans you can buy for the price of a Mustang and a second color television set.
I'm sorry that you feel that we're repeating some of these things.
I don't know why we're doing it.
But actually, the reason I'm asking you these questions again is because some of your answers were very short, and I just wanted you to elaborate on them. That's all. You said that the economy was going to crumble. Do you still feel that way?
Well, I would say that that's no longer speculative. The economy has crumbled. If you look at the cost of living index from the Department of Commerce, and if you look at the unemployment figures, the economy has crumbled, and that will be the Achilles heel of the Nixon administration. But that doesn't matter.
You don't think they can take any steps to offset that?
What possible steps can you take to offset buying planes at $15 million each? How much a P-38 cost? About $65,000. Do you know how much an F-5 costs? $15 million. How can you do that and then chew it up as scrap iron and keep the economy together? How can you possibly do that? And then go on the radio and blame the Negroes because they're on welfare. You can't do it. You also can't do it by setting Americans upon one another as mad dogs, because that's not what this country's about.
We can end our participation in the Vietnam War, and we can stop that. But you don't feel that's going to happen.
End our participation in the Vietnamese War?
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, the Saigon government cannot stand on its own. So the United States cannot withdraw. There'll be a communist government over there.
Saigon government says it can stand on its own.
Really? Then why won't it allow the Americans to withdraw? President Tu said we'd be there for some time to come, as of yesterday.
Is there any person or institution in America that gives you any sense of stability?
Yeah, there are a great many, but you haven't chosen to point to them. I mean, you've pointed to the economy, and you've pointed to police agencies, and you've pointed to a Republican president. If you want to go to the people whom I admire, that would necessarily have to be a list which is limited. I draw my inspiration from people who are, one, talented. I believe in that magic which only God can bestow and man can enact during his short walk across this parched earth between the cradle and the grave. I believe first in the artist. The artist is the only truly inspired person around. After that, I believe perhaps in the men of virtue. Some of them are no longer with us, but when I want personal inspiration, I sometimes have to turn to the thoughts of men who are no longer with us, such as Russell, Lord Russell, people like that. I believe, I don't think you can stop an idea. Therefore, even if you kill a man, you can't stop an idea. I'm afraid that there is more inspiration, unfortunately, in Patrice Lumumba or Jomo Kenyatta than there is in Hubert Humphrey or somebody talking about pollution. You know, we can't... See, there are far too many shelters, which is a word a friend of mine uses, for liberals, places to hide, to pretend that they're dealing with problems, like mass transit, shelters, Indians, Negroes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But first of all, no one has a right to fractionate America. The common cause is humanity. Humanity took a gigantic step backwards with World War II when we accepted genocide as a premise. 54 million people died. And we didn't set a very good example ourselves at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then we go from there into trying to live with murder. And it just isn't a good bedmate. because you can't get much sleep. Because if you close your eyes, might eat you. It's that simple.
All right, Mort, can we go from names like Patrice Lumumba and Jomo Kenyatta to some names that are more easily identified with our listeners, like Chief Ed Davis of the Los Angeles Police Force?
I have a feeling, you know, that even as powerful as Ed Davis is, I feel that Jomo Kenyatta will have more to say in the history books and probably more effect on our lives than Ed Davis.
That's probably so, but we'd like to talk about some local issues for now, and then maybe we can get back to Patrice Lumumba.
All right, but no controversy, because as far as fluoridation, I've made up my mind as well.
But you know, Lumumba was never on the Putnam News. That's something that Ed Davis can say.
Well,
That's true.
The Smothers Brothers may think that Ed Davis is an issue. I don't, but go ahead.
I'd like to know what you think of Ed Davis's performance as chief of police.
He's doing exactly as fine a job as the president. He's doing exactly what he was hired for. And in that sense, I'd say he's an employee of extreme fidelity. In other words, he's quite consistent. That consistency I like, by the way. It's kind of reassuring. I can't find it from too many people on my side, but the police departments serve a purpose. I mean, they're all we have, you know, to defend us against the FBI. They occasionally get an argument with the FBI, which kind of helps. But I don't see them as the enemy. I never have.
Who is the enemy?
Who's the enemy of who? I mean, couldn't we narrow that down a little?
Well,
I mean, it depends what you want to do.
Well, what I want to do is get an answer from you as to what you think Police Chief Davis has done in the community insofar as bridging the gap that exists between young people and the police.
Well, he's overstepped himself at the encouragement of the mayor, I imagine, because no police chief would do it without a mayor's tacit approval. He objected to a network television show, which is a little bit outside his province, I would say, since it's done in Burbank, and outside his artistic province as well, obviously. And he's helped to fractionate the community, but I'm not sure that's not his job. I mean, maybe he's just doing his job. That's what everybody always says to me. They swing the club in the other palm of the other hand. They say, I'm just doing my job.
But how do you feel about the common cop on the beat? I mean, is he a product of his circumstances?
Well, I don't know about that. That's a kind of a fictitious figure, isn't it? The common cop on the beat? It's just he's a victim. Sure, he's a victim. A lot of guys are victims. But the question is, in other words, that's a diversion again. That's like the shelter for the liberals. If we talk about that, we could probably talk about things that have more to do with our destiny than a cop. You know, because those guys
Does a society need a police force?
Well, they can be useful at times. Let's see what I'm trying to figure out what they do. The Department of Animal Regulation is who you call when people are noisy next door. Let's see, who else do you call? Sheriff of the county, FBI for security cases, CIA for espionage, a Secret Service for counterfeiting, alcohol tax and firearms unit. If people are bringing in narcotics, the highway patrol for the freeways. I'm trying to find something for the police to do. I'll come up with something. How long is the show?
They could always bust the free press, which they do occasionally.
Well, they have to get in line behind the Cubans, don't they? As I understand it.
Well, talking about policemen.
Yes.
Ruben Salazar, who is the news director for Spanish-language station KMEX-TV, stated recently that policemen tend to have different attitudes toward enforcing the law, depending on the social, financial, and racial makeup of the people they deal with. Do you agree with that point of view?
Well, yeah, it's obviously true, but they too are victims of misinformation. I don't think that genetically they're brought up that way. I don't really believe that any man was born with a crew cut in the middle of the floor of the Akron. No.
What were your own relations with police before you became well known? Has your relationship changed for better or worse?
Well, I've never been arrested. You might be interested in knowing my father was an employee of the Department of Justice for 19 years. I was a military policeman in the Army.
You were a military policeman?
Yes, I was. Yes, I was a military policeman. And
shows you what can happen.
It's too bad we don't have... I was in the escort guard, by the way. during World War II, bringing back German prisoners whom I would encourage to try to escape and take the necessary measures. And I also was a bit of a maverick when I was in the service, and I put out a newspaper as a hobby, an avocation. My off hours, I was then stationed with the 404th Bomb Group, and I put out a newspaper called Poop from the Group, which was vernacular at that time. And they had a rule there that a man must not be promoted until he'd been in grade 45 days. So the base commander, Colonel Mulzer, had a chauffeur who was a private, and he felt that his chauffeur should be a technical sergeant. And so he promoted him every 15 days. So I pointed that out in a headline in which I said, most of us are crumbs on the table of organization, and it's printed on sheet rubber for officers' purposes. And for that, I was transferred to sweeping out airplane hangars in the Aleutian Islands. I was past Russia, which will give you an idea of where I was. But that backfired. It's interesting about the established order. They shipped us home first. Because when I got out there, the guys had been out there so long, you know, that they were, a lot of the guys are going to the chaplain asking if they could marry dogs.
For those of you joining us late, our guest tonight on Confrontation is political satirist Mort Sahl. Mort, last time you were on our program, we asked you if things would be different in Vietnam if Eugene McCarthy were president. And your answer was that if McCarthy wanted to stop the war and fire Hoover and reorganize the CIA, which you said has its own foreign policy, then he would need a 1,000-man bodyguard, and then he could take that on.
That was my answer earlier this evening, too.
Right. But are you implying that the president is a pawn of the CIA and the FBI?
No, I'm suggesting that those forces are deeply embedded within our society, and they don't want the racket to end. And I don't blame them. If I were them, I wouldn't want it to end either, since I'm not fitted for anything else except murder and being a professional parasite. Nonetheless, they must be removed from the body of the animal so that he can run freely and frolic in the fields, which is what God meant for him. Therefore, we have to make a choice. I choose America. I don't choose them. I do not choose to accommodate murder. That means I must confront them, and I must eradicate them. And I hope that many of you will join me, because that's what we're going to have to do. You're going to have to make up your mind. I'm very serious about this. You're going to have to make up your mind one day that whether you're going to have a forum all day or you're going to do something about saving America. Now, this is all that's left. I've been all around the world, and I can tell you this is all that's left. And we've got to save this. It was given to us for safekeeping. Now, I suggest that our parents, our grandparents who came west and learned to live with animals and with Indians and with the Continental Divide, and mastered it and insulated themselves from disease and from nature, handed that to us, not so we could have a good time. People keep saying to me, oh, when is this ever going to end? It's a real struggle. It's going to end when you're in a coffin. Well, why do I have to keep struggling? Because that's your job.
And so what does Joe Citizen do? The guy who works 8 to 5 and here's...
Well, he doesn't sit up there in Laurel Canyon with a shirt made out of the American flag and smoke pot. That's one thing he doesn't do. That's all out. As far as Joe Citizen, you know, you don't have to worry about him. He's doing all the wrong things. I'm talking to the intelligent people out there. I'm making a plea to them. They'd better get interested in this country soon. In fact, I can't even guarantee that it can be salvaged. All we can do is struggle to try and keep it going. I suggest that everybody go back, for instance, and read the 3rd volume of Bertrand Russell's autobiography. That'll give you a little reason for living.
You've been saying what you just said for a long time on college campuses and tours and all.
Yeah.
Do you think that that has, in any measure, led to some of the demonstrations that have been occurring across the country?
No, it hasn't, and I'll tell you why. My act of addressing people is not a provocative act. I generally do a humorous presentation when I'm on a campus, almost universally, as a matter of fact. However, there are people who arrive and a certain scenario takes place. The ROTC building suddenly is aflame. People write 4-letter words on the wall. People light up joints. And there's a battle on the lawn. That scenario is planted so that the left-wing dialogue can be controlled in this country. In other words, so that the dialogue between the left and the right is all controlled by elements of the federal government. That's not what it's about. I don't provoke people to that. I provoke people to save themselves. And the way to save themselves is not to eat others. There's other nutrition.
Do you think the federal government was serious when they said that some of those National Guardsmen at Kent State should be prosecuted?
Of course they were. As a matter of fact, the FBI said it, and there are guys in the FBI who believe in the system to such a point that if they hadn't been discouraged by their director, they would have arrested the men who killed John Kennedy without thinking twice. There are honest squares in there who would have gone ahead, but they were pulled back.
And do you think those men will ever be prosecuted?
Well, if we're not so separated by time from our grief, what I would like to see happen, of course, is I would like to see the men who did it hanged, and then I would like to see capital punishment abolished. And then I'd like to take my kid by the hand, and I'd like to show them their faces in a book. And I'd like to say, Johnny, those are the last men who were executed in this country when America was barbaric because they hurt President Kennedy.
Mort, can we get back to the CIA for just a minute? I know how
Terrific.
I know how you love to talk about them.
Well, they're all around us. You know, you can't go wrong.
That's very true. You've said that intelligence agencies like the CIA are not really within the government. You said that they're bigger than the government. Could you give us an example as to how these government-funded intelligence agencies are actually operating outside the government? A specific example.
I will tell you that because of legal action, which is coming up in Louisiana, I will not complete all these paragraphs, but I will tell you this. There are self-appointed leaders of youth in this country, self-proclaimed leaders. They're people that know better. They're people who were let out on bail from Chicago, for instance, who were told not to make seditious statements, and then go out and make unguarded statements and are encouraged in it by their lawyers. I'd like to know, for instance, I'll tell you that there are Central Intelligence Agency people planted on the left as on the right, as I said earlier, as when we were talking about the hard hats demonstrating in New York. I will tell you that I doubt the credibility, and with good reason, of several of the most popular speakers with the left on campus and with the defense attorneys involved with the Panthers. Some of them. And there is the reason they would be planted there is this, where those people are most defenseless, because they trust those men. They've been gotten to, and their job is to confuse the issue. You know what the new left is on most campuses I visit? It's 90% ignorant kids who don't know yet. When I say ignorant, I don't mean morons. I mean that their views are not fully formed, and they will not be faithful to them. I mean, they won't be rebels at 97 like Russell was. It's 90% that, and 10% CIA men penetrating the group.
Did you say that the attorneys themselves of the Panthers are CIA agents? Like Charles Gary?
I said that some of them were. No, Gary is not among them.
Okay.
I said some of them were. There are plants.
Mort, let's get to another one of your favorite topics. And that is the Vice President, Spiro Agnew. Do you feel Vice President Agnew's attacks on the press are justified?
Yeah, for all the wrong reasons. I
Like?
certainly do. Well, because most of the people I meet in this country, including people in the press, are wholly ignorant of what's going on in this country. Now, we have to assume either that I am the most intelligent man in the United States, or I am the only one with any access to news. Now, that's unlikely. And yet, I don't meet anybody who knows anything. That means the press isn't doing its job. The press, first of all, they were entirely intimidated as soon as you started any intellectual attack against them.
How were they intimidated? What did they change after Agnew started attacking them?
What did they change? Do you notice any tone of network news changed at all?
No.
Notice they didn't put... You don't. Well, Weekly Variety, which is dated, let's see, the 22nd of July, states that ABC openly admits that Howard K. Smith is holding the reins back because of Agnew's influence.
Well, that's one reporter. But do you think...
One reporter? He's the anchorman for ABC News.
One of the anchormen. Do you think that Eric Sevareid, perhaps, was intimidated by the vice president's remarks?
I think that Eric Sevareid sold out a long time ago, so it wouldn't matter.
Oh, so then we
It's
shouldn't even
academic.
talk about it. I see.
I mean, do you find that... Did you see the three men interviewing the president?
No, I missed that.
Have you heard...
show.
You missed that show. Well, I can tell you the three men interviewed the president and didn't ask him any questions. Have you ever heard of an interview where no one asked anybody any questions? They asked the president nothing. Did you notice that after Agnew's attack on the press, they no longer analyzed the president's addresses when he finished? No one analyzes them anymore. They just stand there in shock. They're paralyzed. Well, they've obviously been intimidated. And what did he claim, Agnew? He said, I speak for the silent majority. Now, I've heard of a lot of guys. You know, Frank Sinatra used to say, I have the Bobby Soxers. And I've heard Tom Jones say that he has the girls. Here comes a guy now from Maryland who claims a constituency of people we can't hear. So how can we dispute it? You know all those people who never say anything? Well, they're my fans. Terrific.
Mort, what questions would you have liked those three newsmen to ask President Nixon, which they didn't ask him? For instance, you say they didn't ask him any questions. Obviously, they asked him questions, but they weren't the right ones insofar as you were concerned.
Well, since you did not see the program, you don't know whether they asked him anything.
He didn't speak for 1 hour alone. There were questions asked, right?
Did you see the program that President Johnson did with the three?
Yes, I did.
You remember his arguing with Frank Reynolds? Well, it wasn't the same kind of a program. I don't take that lightly. When it says a conversation with President Richard Nixon, I expect a conversation with him. I expect somebody to ask him something. Now, I know all those guys. It was Sevareid and Chancellor, who are pretty bright guys. They didn't ask him anything. They didn't ask him anything they could have asked him. They could have asked him about two. They could have asked him about the fact that why is it that with you and Ronald Reagan and Mayor Yorty and Max Rafferty, no schools are open. They could have asked them that. How are you going to open the schools? Why are universities closed? Why don't you care whether you're a one-term president in your 57th year? Why are you willing to make this sacrifice? What does it mean if the Tories win in England?
How about news priorities, Mort? Do you feel they're a bit puzzling? They give many hours of coverage to the space program and perhaps an hour documentary once in a while on such important matters as education and Vietnam and
Television?
race relations.
NBC has a show right now exposing the American Medical Association as a group of cynical men who exploit misery. Why don't they show it?
Do you think there is an alternative press in America? Has the underground press served any purpose? Is it serving any purpose now?
Yeah, it serves a purpose. It gives us an alternative, and it gives us some news we wouldn't get otherwise. It's confused, but it's all we have. For instance, it makes us feel that the only people that are in jail are Negroes. But we can all go to jail, and we should all remember that. They got a lot of room. They got a lot of jails and a lot of cells. It endorses anything that the establishment finds shocking. Therefore, it digresses and it fractionates its efforts in a drug culture and in pornography, mistaking it for eroticism. But that's only immaturity. I think they're wasting space. I'd like to see them do some more.
Do you think they made a mistake by printing the names of the narcotics agents?
I don't know. I didn't see that issue. I don't have any interest in that.
Well, how'd you feel about it? Do you feel that was a public service? Was it an irresponsible act of journalism?
Well, I'd hardly classify it as irresponsible. We'll have to, you see, you're talking about legalistics now. And if it's legalistics, the real question is, are they guilty of receiving stolen property, or are they not? If they're guilty of printing those names and thereby corrupting us, then the question is the Los Angeles Times guilty of trying Manson before he ever got to court, of portraying him as a freak so that we think he's guilty of anything or capable of anything?
Mm-hmm.
Those are all questions I think we have to ask ourselves. And I wonder if we'll get an answer very rapidly.
Mort, how about Governor Reagan? Have you changed your opinion any as to his performance as governor?
Well, once I saw that Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra approved of him, I realized that I should reevaluate, because I like to be with the winning team.
That was my next question. What do you think of the endorsements of Sinatra and Dean Martin?
I think Reagan is doomed. I'm surprised that he would become involved with somebody like that. Why would he want to do that? And he's very successful. I mean, he looks like he's going to be reelected. He acts like it. In fact, if I didn't admire the man so much, I'd almost compare his attitude with one of arrogance. But I can't think another word that does come to mind. But for all of that, Murphy has a similar attitude. For all of that, why would he want the endorsement of those people? In other words, isn't that a detrimental endorsement? Would that help you? I mean, would you vote for anybody because Frank Sinatra voted for him, or would you wonder why Frank Sinatra wants you to vote for him?
I think a lot of Californians would be swayed by Sinatra or Dean Martin voting for them. I don't say it's a good thing, but I think they would be.
I suggest to you that Frank Sinatra and all these other people who were once pop culture heroes are wholly irrelevant. In a day and age when a kid's head is opened in Chicago by a policeman's club and he's singing My Kind of Town, and Barbara Streisand is 26 years old and she doesn't know what the initials SDS stand for, that those people don't mean anything. The movies that they make theaters empty. You heard of people that do bad business? They drive people out who are already occupying the theater. They're gone. They don't mean anything anymore. I call them mythical figures, but then you might compare them to Apollo, so I don't want to do that either. I can't believe that. I wonder what the governor was thinking of. He must have had some kind of a strategy in his mind.
They may be irrelevant figures, but some of them get elected, like George Murphy, and Rudy Valley is our next big Senate candidate now, or so he says.
Well, when did Frank Sinatra ever get elected to anything?
No, but you said...
I'm taking you at your word.
Yeah, but you
don't
said
take me at my word.
You said the people in Hollywood are irrelevant.
I said they were irrelevant figures. But Ronald Reagan, Frank Sinatra was successful in Hollywood at one point, and Dean Martin is successful in Hollywood at this point. Ronald Reagan was never successful in Hollywood. He had a program called the General Electric Theater, which he was not allowed to act in. He had to introduce it and get out of the way before the story started. And at that time, you may recall, the General Electric's executives were taken away in handcuffs, charged with price fixing, mumbling something about progress being their most important product. Let's not forget the lessons of the past. My God, that's why we're here. That's incredible. You see, I detect a note of cynicism, and I think there's a great deal to be encouraged about. I think the fact that a whole generation has come along and has ignored Frank Sinatra is very promising. When people don't know who he is, I would say that's an advancement in knowledge.
Speaking of advancement, were you surprised at Mayor Yorty's re-election for a third term?
No, I'm surprised that the Social Democrats in this town who abandoned Jimmy Roosevelt, who could have beaten him. I'm surprised at the way the liberals continue. They continue. I'll never forget being up there in the middle of that valley, in Delano with Chavez, and watching a guy up in a tree trying to take a picture of Bob Kennedy and Chavez. And they said, "You'll fall out of the tree." And Bob Kennedy said to him, "With Reagan's attitude toward Medicare in this state, you better not break your leg when you fall out of that tree." I'm surprised at how the liberals, even when things are set up for them, they can't elect anybody. They're unbelievable. They almost look like they're taking a dive because the other guy can't box. Look what they're doing now. In other words, look at the campaign now in this state. Look at the campaign for I don't know who's running for what. I do know, but look at all the people that are running. Look at what they're doing. Look at the Democratic Party now. Look at the disarray it's in. Can it afford disarray at a time like this? And isn't Reagan's arrogance basically, and Murphy's, based on the fact that they think there are no alternatives to them? Of course, the quality of shame is gone, too. Abe Fortas had to resign. Murphy didn't resign. Even though Technicolor fired him, he didn't resign. And he has to move into the other half of the apartment, because they withdrew his salary. Is he going to stay in the kitchen, or will he be in the living room?
I think he resigned the day after they fired him.
I stand corrected.
What about Wally Hickel? Do you think he's made any change at all from... I mean, you once called him the Shell answer man, I think.
Shell's answer. I remember when Nixon appointed him, he said, I saw the fires of creative imagination burning in the eyes of Wally Hickel. And it occurred to me that may be the reason that Dick Nixon's the president and you and I are not, because he can see things that you and I cannot.
But do you
I'll
think
stand by
Wally
that.
Hickel is still as establishment as he was then? I mean,
No, I think any guy, I think anybody who represents most of the oil interests in Alaska but stands up in his middle 50s and says, hey, listen, I just found these students. Come here, look at the microscope under the slide. I think that makes him, a left-winger. That's ridiculous.
But if Hickel wanted to, he could pull up stakes and go back to Alaska and resume being a millionaire, and yet he's sticking it out.
What do you mean he's sticking it out? You're making it sound like he's camping in the wilderness.
When I say sticking it out, I mean that Nixon, I think, would very much like to get rid of him.
You really believe that Nixon would like to get rid of Hickel and can't? Has the president been gracious about anything he wanted to expedite up until now? Like, for instance, when he emasculated General Creighton Abrams at the orders of Richard Helms. He took the orders of Richard Helms. I repeat that charge. The president took the orders of Richard Helms and emasculated one of the noblest warriors in the history of this country, General Creighton Abrams. Was he gracious about that? Was he gracious about Robert Finch, who's practically the only man of civility in that cabinet? Was he gracious about that? Was he gracious at all? Wouldn't John Kennedy have called the families of the 4 people after Kent State? Wouldn't he have called them? That's exactly what John Kennedy would have done. Richard Nixon didn't say anything.
Richard Nixon wrote a personal letter to all the parents of the children who were killed at Kent State. I don't know if he called them.
And John Kennedy called Coretta King when Martin Luther King was in jail. Big difference. More difference.
Is this country headed for a revolution? And if it is, how far away are we from it?
We're much closer than we think, and all the diversion in the world will not take us away from it. And stereo won't help. I know that's hard to believe. Even when the video cassettes come, it won't help. I know that's even harder to believe. Yeah, the country's headed for a revolution because they won't listen. But I want to tell a lot of the people out there, some of the forward-thinking people, if you're waiting for the kids to save you, first of all, you have no right to. And secondly, kid is a transitory label. After all, how long is someone a kid? How long is someone a revolutionary? That's just a button you get to wear for the moment. That's like being in sick bay. You got to be back on duty in A1 condition on Monday morning. The kids are going to be anesthetized very fast by this administration unless things change very, very fast. I just don't think people are going to continue to go in the Army. I think that people have lost their focus and they've lost their purpose. In other words, for those people on the left, for instance, who think America is an oligarchy, who believe that we trample over little countries and all that, I don't think we even believe in it that much anymore.
Do you think Nixon's draft reform in the form of a lottery, which he thought would appease the young people, do you think that was a sham?
Nixon there are 3 parts to it. Let's examine them briefly. One of them is a professional army, which is no more than a junta. I don't want a foreign legion here. I want a citizens' militia. I want a citizens' army. The army in Cuba, it's the only Latin American country that has a citizens' army, instead of those guys with those Gestapo hats. I don't want any professional soldiers. And I think that the lottery reform was just a play for time. There's a question of how long he can play it out. His assignment is to play it out for 4 years. And by that time, they'll go through the charade again, if there's an election.
Mort, Attorney General John Mitchell was recently quoted as saying that he thinks students may have finally learned that rioting is entirely unproductive. And he expects less campus unrest this coming fall. Now, you, perhaps more than any other performer, have your finger on the pulse of the college campus. Do you think the Attorney General is right?
No, I think that's a warning. I think that was issued as a warning. The Attorney General's experience is largely in municipal bonds. He doesn't know anything about the job he has. I say that with the utmost respect. And as far as knowing the voices of the students, he can't hear anything above the strident voice of his wife. And I think that he does not understand. There's going to be a revolt in this country if they don't make some changes. And oddly enough, it won't come from the people who have the most right to it, who are black people and brown people and poor people.
If you were a college student today, what do you think you'd be doing? Would you be throwing rocks or studying in the library?
I've seen very few students who do throw rocks. I have seen a lot of students who say, what the hell is going on here? You know, Bertrand Russell said, young people ask the society why. All the society has to do is stop long enough by the side of the road to tell them why, and they might even go. But if you're not prepared to answer the question, why, you must be prepared for the results of not answering. That's really what it comes down to in a logician's mind. And I believe that I don't see any people throwing rocks, and I don't see many violent people. I think that what's happening is that they're desensitized. I don't think that they're going to overthrow the government, but they're going to continue to find no purpose. I want to make this very clear, to quote a great president. Abby Hoffman said to me recently, I don't have a president. I don't recognize Nixon, and I feel liberated. I think if you don't have a president that you recognize, I think you're impoverished, not liberated. And as long as our young people are impoverished of focus and desensitized, what can they do but wander around and bump into walls? They can't find a reason. I suggest to you that the entire propagation of drug culture in America is a result of the fact that in the 30s, you could look to Franklin Roosevelt to help you change the horizon. And today, all you can do is try and change your own perspective of that horizon because you feel futile about changing anything else.
If things are deteriorating as fast as they are, do we have the luxury of sitting back and asking why?
It's not a luxury, it's a necessity, because they're marching us into China. And if it weren't for one senator from Arkansas, you and I would be sharing a pup tent on the mainland of China now. And I don't know whether we would be holding our own.
Mort, we're running short of time, but earlier before we began the program... What a prophetic statement.
Yeah.
You mentioned to me that you took over Brad Crandall's talk show in New York City and that you had an interesting experience on there. I wonder if you'd tell us about it.
All right, I'd be happy to, Ben. Brad Crandall is a talk jockey on NBC. We might as well tell the people because his renown is not nationwide. And after I had my talk show here at KLAC, AM and FM, which is just up the street here, what did they used to say, Vic and Sade? Do you remember that program, Vic and Sade? The little house, they used to describe the little house halfway up in the next block. Anyway, KLAC, the little station halfway back in the next century. Anyway, I took over Crandall's show, and they have no producer in New York on the shows. You know that.
You pick the phone calls, right?
You take the calls. I objected to that, and I was told that the program belongs to the listeners. During the time I had the program, I tripled the listenership in 5 days, and I doubled the sponsorship in 9 days. My reward for that was to be fired. Why? Because people called in and asked about the assassination of John Kennedy. And believe it or not, the authorities at NBC Radio told me, don't mention Kennedy's name on the air. And I said, is that possible in today's America? I said that in the office. And the president of NBC Radio said to me, you can do it. You're a pro.
Was that Lubunsky?
It was his stand-in. Lubunsky was in Puerto Rico planning bigger things for the network.
Okay, Mort, we're just about at the end of the program, but I have one last question for you, and
Hit
that
me.
is this.
Yes.
Was there any truth to the rumor that you were you mentioned NBC, was there any truth to the rumor that you were being considered as a possible replacement to Chet Huntley?
You mean on the ranch?
No, with the Brinkley Sahl report.
Well, as a matter of fact, Chancellor had that set up a long time ago. You really asked the wrong guy. But the fact of the matter is that it's too bad that that's our best joke tonight because the audience is stuck with trusting me. I want you to think about that as you go home tonight. In all of America, I'm the only guy who has your ear in any media who's not grinding an axe. I don't work for anybody but myself. I worry at income tax time. I work for a living. I pay taxes. And it looks like I'm a solid believer in capitalism. You can't hardly find guys like that anymore. I vote for guys out of passion, not because I think they'll help me later. I know that makes me a solitary man, but if I have to be lonely, well, so be it. Back to my cell. Another cup of hemlock.
Mort, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Our guest tonight, sometimes bitter, sometimes charming, oft-times humorous, and always stimulating and controversial, Mort Sahl. On behalf of my co-host, Dick Trubo, this is Ben Thumb, thanking you for joining us tonight.
And all you servicemen out there in the audience, I want to thank you all.
You've been listening to Confrontation. The opinions expressed on this program were not necessarily those of this station, its management, or employees.